Today, the German economy is one of the most developed social market economies in the world. It is the largest in Europe and the fourth largest globally. Its GDP has reached a staggering $3.95 trillion. It may seem as though Germany has always had a highly advanced economy, but this is far from the truth. After the Second World War, Germany was left in ruins and their economy was completely destroyed. Their house stock went down by 80%, their food production was cut in half, and a third of their industrial outputs were gone. On top of that, the unreasonable laws created by the Nazis, such as food rationing, price controls, and high taxes, were still in effect. Germany had also separated into different sections as a result of the Yalta Conference. The Russians occupied the East under communism, and the French, British, and Americans occupied the West under a democracy. After the war, West Germany began to rebuild its economy to the powerhouse that it is today. The role of the government was the key aspect that led the economy towards recovery as they introduced new laws that were in favor of the German people. This allowed German businesses the opportunity to reconstruct and become a part of the global market. Consumers, producers, and the government were all affected as the economy went from being in ruins to being one of the largest in the world. This period of change in the German economy is known as the economic miracle. The different stakeholders in this issue included almost everyone, as rebuilding the nation was the main focal point for Germany. The different stakeholders included consumers, producers, the government of Germany, as well as other countries, mainly large powers such as Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. After World War II, most people were left wandering and searching for food and other necessities. As the catastrophes of war had led to many people being homeless, many traveled all over the continent in search for shelter. During this time, the cost of living index was 31% higher than in 1938, but the amount of money in the economy was 5 times more than in 1938. This resulted in high inflation of prices while greatly decreasing the value of the Reichsmark currency. Because of this, people could not afford basic necessities. All over Germany, especially the British occupation zone, food rationing had gotten out of hand. There were strict food rations set, and people were to survive on less than 1,000 calories per day. Price controls on food continued to increase shortages as price ceilings prevented the prices from exceeding a certain amount. The shortages had even led to people growing their own food. When the war ended around 1948, workers would miss around 9.5 hours of work in a week, since the money they earned had almost no value. They would instead use this time to barter and look for necessities. By October of that same year, the average went down to 4.2 hours per week, and bartering decreased significantly. This was due to the introduction of the new currency, the Deutschmark. When the Deutschmark had been introduced, consumer goods had appeared in the markets overnight. This provided consumers with a new outlook. With the new currency, consumers were able to purchase goods and services that they needed. Citizens had gained motivation and felt a purpose to work, since the money they earned had value. After the war, Germany had to pay reparations to the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. This included having to get rid of thousands of factories, manufacturing plants, and equipment, along with their agriculture, housing, and industrial markets getting destroyed. This resulted in industrial output and food production to decrease significantly. Industrial output in 1947 was only 1/3 of what it was in 1938, and the food production in 1947 was only 51% of what it was in 1938. After the arrival of a stable currency, consumer goods reappeared right away because producers could charge the real price for goods, which was higher than the government-authorized artificial prices. In June 1948, the industrial production was 51% of how much it was in 1936. Because of the government's new laws, industrial production reached to 78% of its levels in 1936, meaning that the industrial production increased by over 50%. The industrial output tripled within 2 years. Producers were able to control the means of production, choose prices, and wages. Businesses also began to invest capital into German industries, allowing them to grow. Trading with other countries also increased, even though there were no Eastern European markets. Between 1948 to 1952, foreign trade increased by 84.4% per year. This was partially a result of the Korean War. As Korea had been a great source of imports for many countries, their industrial trade had significantly reduced during the time of the war. Therefore, countries such as the United States had to look for other countries to supply them their materials for the war. Thus, Germany was able to increase their exports by supplying warfare goods to the United States. The growth didn't just stop there. During the 1950s, foreign trade continued to increase 16% each year. Since Germany reintegrated back into the global economy, they began exporting manufactured goods rather than raw materials like coal and scrap metal. After World War II had ended with the victory of the Allies, the three big Allied leaders, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, had come together for the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference was held on February 1945 in Crimea. The main purpose was to decide what to do with Germany once it had been defeated. Roosevelt had suggested that Germany be divided into small pieces, a strategy for limiting its future capacity for war. The Roosevelt plan would abolish the German nation and create several smaller self-governing nations. Stalin willingly agreed as he had more to lose than the United States. Churchill had also agreed, but for other reasons. He wanted to fill Germany with small, economically fragile nation-states. He believed that dividing Germany in three small nations would be enough for economic growth, as well as be small enough to be managed and controlled. In the end, Germany was divided into 4 different occupation zones, one led by each of the Allies, including the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. Over the next several years, several zones had come together. First, the US and Britain merged their occupation zones to become Bizonia. This was followed by the French occupation zone joining them to become Trizonia, or as we call it, West Germany. On the contrary, the Soviet Union occupation zone became East Germany. Both East and West Germany had 2 very different political systems, which caused the growth of the 2 economies to differ. There were great differences, such as the productivity in the East being 30% lower than in the West. West Germany held democratic views which came from Britain, the US, and the French beliefs and their political systems. East Germany lost the opportunity to develop after the war because of its communist political system under Stalin, and Germany as a whole lost the opportunity to develop its economy because of the separation.
Germany was ruled by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party between the years of 1933 and 1945. In these years, the type of economic system in place was a dictatorship. Under Hitler's rule, Germany became a totalitarian state where almost everything was controlled by the government and the citizens of Germany had very few basic human rights. Nazi Germany had a command economy in place because the Nazi Party wanted to increase control over the whole economy, which they were able to do through political regulation and interference. After World War II, the Allied powers didn't want the Nazis to be a part of the new government. This led to Ludwig Erhard, who had clearly been against the Nazis, to be chosen as the Bavarian Minister of Finance in 1945. Bavaria is one of the states of Germany. During the Nazi regime, Ludwig was one of the members of the school of economic thought called the Sozialmarktwirtschaft, or social free market, that was based at the University of Freiburg. This group was completely against totalitarianism that the Nazi government represented. They wanted free markets and wanted the government to decrease monopoly that businesses had over markets. He was against the use of price controls and believed that currency reform would give the economy the boost that it needed. Currency reform would make sure that the amount of goods would be parallel to the amount of currency. On June 20th, 1948, the German government reformed their currency and introduced a new currency called Deutschmarks, instead of the previous currency, Reichsmarks. This was done to get rid of the extreme inflation, bartering, and black market trades. A smaller amount of Deutschmarks were substituted for Reichsmarks. This resulted in the money supply to decrease, causing fewer shortages, and the overall money supply contracted by 93%. This change got Germany back to having normal price formations that hadn't existed since the mid 1930s. On the same day, the government removed price controls. This was a controversial move, and many people advised against it, but Erhard believed that it would work. Most manufactured goods, as well as vegetables, fruits, and eggs, had all been freed of any controls. The ceiling prices of other goods were also increased. They completely removed the rationing system so consumers could now communicate their demands to producers more easily. The higher prices also pushed the producers to continue to supply more in order to meet the needs of people. On top of this, the government cut tax rates to allow people to keep a suitable amount of money in order to survive in society. This can be shown by looking at the average income in Germany. In 1948, if a person earned 2,400 Deutschmarks, they would have been taxed 85%. But if that same person made that much in 1950, they would only be taxed 18%. The corporate income tax rate, which was between 35% to 65%, was changed to 50%. The highest tax bracket still stayed at 95%, but this was only for individuals that had an income of over 250,000 Deutschmarks a year. This was much better compared to 1946, where all income above 6,000 Deutschmarks was taxed at 95%. The actions of the government had caused a dramatic impact overnight. People began to see the value of the new currency, causing stores to become stocked. The black market was abolished and bartering was no longer done. The Marshall Plan, also known as the European Recovery Program, was an American program created in 1948 to provide aid to Europe after the war. This consisted of the U.S. investing $13.2 billion in the European economy, with Germany receiving a majority of it. The Americans chose to help as they were worried about having the same results as World War I. They led the Marshall Plan and other reconstruction projects to ensure that German reparations wouldn't create the same financial mess as the last war. The main benefit was that it allowed Germany to successfully re-enter European markets. It helped the country's economy in the long run, as it allowed them to gain strong economic policies that haven't been challenged since. Around 1924, Canada admitted Germans into the country, but they were classified as non-preferred immigrants. During that time, the Germans that were let in the country were primarily restricted to agricultural and domestic work. Nearing the end of the 1920s, the stigma had started to disappear and the Germans were promoted to the preferred class, whereas after World War II, there was a different situation. In an effort to aid Germany, Canada had permitted around 15,000 East European ethnic Germans between 1945 to 1950. By 1960, there were approximately 500,000 Germans that had immigrated to Canada. The ones that had entered the country after World War II had mostly found work in secondary industries, but they were quickly able to obtain income levels similar to or even higher than those of British or French Canadians. With the large German immigrant market, Germans created self-employment opportunities and were 19% of all new businesses started by immigrants. One of the biggest goals for the West German economy after World War II was to lead the country into a position of new welfare from mass unemployment. West Germany had high hopes of social planning policies directed to enhancing the quality of life for all groups in society. There were approximately 7 million people who were displaced from their homes in the Allied-occupied Germany. Therefore, the Allies' main focus in the early years was promoting the construction of houses and integrating millions of migrants. Along with this, the German government's first budget included increasing sickness benefits by 9.3%, pensions for war widows by 25%, pensions for the war wounded by 16%, and retirement pensions by 5%. This was later followed by a gradual expansion and reform of the Social Security system. The Great Old Age Pensions Reform Act of 1957 had also been a great step forward in improving their welfare state. This act linked pensions to development of salaries. In relation to healthcare, the Christian Democratic Party, which ruled Germany between 1949 to 1955, had restored the healthcare system on a national level. Sickness fund contributions were now shared equally between employees and employers. The insurance for work-related accidents and invalidity continued to be entirely financed by employers, yet trade unions were granted a 50% representation. Due to the Allies, the health insurance and healthcare system in the western part of Berlin were governed differently than East Germany. For example, a unified health insurance was maintained until the early 1960s. The welfare system greatly improved the social and economic conditions in Germany post World War II.
As Germany was in complete ruins, most companies were destroyed and many ceased to exist. This had led to a similar effect on the German markets. Due to the influence of the occupants and the help from the Marshall Plan, several large companies either were formed or new companies were created, which had boosted the economic growth in Germany. These companies followed the basic principle of the theory of the firm and aimed to maximize profits. One of the biggest companies that came out of this period was Volkswagen. Volkswagen was founded by the German Labor Front, who were a National Socialist labor organization and were under the orders of Adolf Hitler. The basis of this project was to develop a vehicle for the common people and was known as the People's Car. The company had started production in 1937 and had only made a small number of cars before the production had been stopped at the beginning of World War II. The factories in West Germany had remained in relatively good shape, even though they had been a target of bombing. Ivan Hurst, a British Army officer and engineer, had went to inspect the factory, which resulted in him saving the German motor industry and rebuilding a company that ended up producing over 100 million vehicles. When the factory had first started up, British authorities had ordered 20,000 cars straight away and had doubled the order in a month. The issue with this was production. The firm simply did not have enough supplies and they were difficult to find. Some supplies had to be smuggled out of other occupational zones in exchange for alcohol and cigarettes, and others had to be made from scratch. Ivan Hurst had involved the workers in running the factories as he believed it created better results in both outputs and labor. The operations of the factory were turning out to be very successful. In 2 months of the operation, Volkswagen had produced 1,000 vehicles, and by October 1946, they had produced 10,000 vehicles. The popularity of these cars increased over time as they were reliable and drove well on bad roads. Daimler-Benz, known as Daimler AG today, is a German automotive corporation that was formed in May 1, 1924, after the merger of the companies Benz & C and Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft. After the merger, they branded their cars with the name Mercedes-Benz. After World War II, many of their factories were destroyed, but they eventually rebuilt them. The Potsdam Agreement made by the Allied powers after World War II stated that all German assets that were out of Germany would be seized and used towards paying the reparations. As a result of this agreement, Daimler-Benz had all of their foreign assets, branches, and subsidiaries taken away from them, and they had to rebuild it all. Their company shrank and had only of its 4 original plants that were located in the south of Germany as well as their West German plants. They finally got a production permit by the American authorities on January 3, 1946. In 1947, their production started up again. Even before currency reform, they made a profit in their 1948-1949 balance sheet, despite the money issues with the Reichsmarks. After the economic miracle, Daimler-Benz successfully bounced back into the economy and their sales skyrocketed as they broke sale records. All of their trucks used diesel engines. During the 1950s, they nearly had a monopoly over automobiles with diesel engines. Because of the prohibition of foreign direct investment that was in place until 1952, they had to collaborate with independent distributors for all of their exports. For their imports, they worked with licensed dealers. By 1955, they had relations with 178 distributors all over the world, and they successfully regained their international affiliates. They continue with the internationalization of their products so that it was designed in a way that could be used in other countries as well. Many economists during that time wanted the economy to run as a free market and industries to have a perfect competition market structure. Ludwig Erhard highly advocated that industry should be a social market economy to benefit all parties. This would also help the market be free of monopolies. Despite what the economists wanted, the automobile industry after World War II operated as oligopoly. Only a few companies dominated the market because smaller companies simply couldn't afford to make vehicles in large quantities. The few large companies are the only ones that can make a profit from this industry. Therefore, this market will always remain as an oligopoly. Allianz is a German multinational financial services corporation that was founded in 1890 by Karl von Thieme and Wilhelm von Fink after they merged their companies. At the end of World War II in 1945, they experienced great difficulty in continuing their business since many of their buildings were being bombed. By the end of the war, most of their assets in real estate were demolished and all of their funds that were invested in government bonds were valueless. In May 1945, they were technically bankrupt. After the war ended, they resumed business and began to rebuild their company within a few days. Since their headquarters in Berlin were destroyed and Germany split into East and West, they rebuilt their new headquarters in Munich. After reconstruction of their business, they became Europe's largest insurance company by the 1970s. For most parts of German history, Germany had a great steel industry. Companies like ArcelorMittal, Bremen, Dillinger Hut, and Otto Wolff had good amounts of raw materials, skilled labor, transport, and more. From 1880 and onwards, the steel industry was based on a business model, which was to maximize their profits. Each enterprise of the industry would be working on different levels of production through vertical integration. This resulted in lower production costs. Under the Nazi rule, Germany had reached steel outputs at 22 million tons. This was the highest it had ever been. This number had been lowered to 18 million tons in 1944 when the Allies were bombing. The Potsdam Agreement had an even greater impact on these numbers. The agreement had clearly stated that all production related to industrial war potential was to be reduced to a minimum level, which was determined by the Allied Control Commission. This agreement resulted in numbers that mirrored the production levels of the industry during the Great Depression. In March 1946, the new restrictions on the industry had limited the steel capacity for all of Germany to 7.5 million tons, with the actual production in any single year to not exceed 5.8 million tons. With the help of the Marshall Plan, the steel industry in West Germany was able to rebuild and modernize its demolished infrastructure. This resulted in increased production of outputs, with 12 million tons in 1950, 34 million tons in 1960, and 46 million tons in 1970. Due to the catastrophic results of World War II, Germany had suffered large amounts of losses in political, social, physical, and economic aspects. Nevertheless, Germany has been able to significantly rebuild its economy to what it is today. With the help of the government, German businesses were given better economic policies that allowed them to rebuild and thrive in the global market. Producers and consumers were all affected as the economy took a turn towards prosperity. This was known as the German economic miracle.